who is the director of the Lake County Extension Office. She has been with the University of Florida for 17 years. Oh, she doesn't look old enough for that, but anyway.
It was part of their kindergarten hiring.
And she's been with Lake County for 13?
14 years.
14 years. That is something, yeah. Her areas of expertise are toxic, invasive weed ID, and management. Animal nutrition, forage production, and basically managing that office over there in Tavares.
Herding cats.
She has a BS in animal science, an MS in animal nutrition, and currently is in a PhD program for science communication. So if you would, please welcome Megan, and we'll listen to what she has to say.
Good afternoon. I am delighted to see so many people with an interest in invasive plants, or were confused about the topic today. Either way, I'm really glad you're here. By a show of hands, who is familiar with the concept of invasive plants? That makes my heart sing. I'm really happy to know that. I'm a 7th generation Floridian, so I have a real vested interest in seeing our state in its natural state. So as Jan shared, my professional expertise is with animals. I typically work with farmers and ranchers. So I like to tell people I'm a crazy horse girl who never grew out of it. Any horse people in the room, equestrians? Yeah, so my parents bought me horseback riding lessons when I was 4 years old, thinking it would be like a series of 7, and I just never stopped, and ended up making a career out of it. But I also, horses eat grass, and sometimes they accidentally eat weeds, so my area of expertise kind of expanded. I went to the University of Florida and got a degree in equine science, and then decided I actually was really, really interested in animal nutrition, specifically in cow stomachs. So I'm a delight at dinner parties because I can talk for hours about the microbes inside cow stomachs. It's my favorite thing. So I went to work for Extension right after I finished my master's degree in 2007, spent a couple years in Marion County, and when the opportunity to come to beautiful Lake County opened up, I came down here. I've been the livestock agent here since 2010, and then came on as director in the fall of 2019, and have been in that position since then. Are y'all familiar with Extension?
Yes.
And kind of what we do. Oh, that makes my heart sing as well. I wanted to go into my spiel, but in Lake County, we're very lucky. Not only do we have a very good team of extension agents, a very strong Master Gardener volunteer program, we also have a beautiful discovery garden. If you have been over to our office, it is a 3-acre teaching garden. It's really unique in the state. I like to call it the rooms to go of gardens, because it's designed such that each of the individual gardens, and I always get the number wrong, sometimes I'll tell you it's 23, other times I'll tell you it's 29, it's 20-something gardens, but they're each designed to be about the size of the average Florida backyard, and they each have a different theme. So you can kind of walk through and see a meditation garden, or a Mediterranean garden, or a shade garden, or a rose garden, and kind of see like what it would actually look like off the page and in real life and as a mature planting, and what these actual Florida-friendly plants look like and learn. So it's a beautiful place to go have a picnic, but it's also a great place to go and play in your own backyard. So we're open Monday through Friday from 8 to 4, and also the 3rd Saturday of every month, which means tomorrow. So if you guys feel like, I'm sorry, not tomorrow, this Saturday. I'm trying to speed the week along, y'all. It's been a long, it's been a week. If y'all want to come out and check out our gardens on Saturday, I highly encourage you to do so. Although you're retired, so every day is Saturday, come out whenever you'd like. But today I want to talk to you about invasive species, and the purpose of this talk is to kind of establish a common language for talking about invasive species, because there's a lot of confusing terms that we use. We kind of talk about them even amongst professionals and folks who understand invasive species, we sometimes define them in confusing ways. So I want to get on a common page about what exactly is an invasive species, how should we talk about it, and how should we avoid talking about it. I want to develop a real appreciation for the impact that invasive species have in our state and why we should all deeply care about this, This is not one of those problems that only affects some people. It potentially affects every single person who lives in Florida. And then, once I thoroughly depressed everyone, I want to give you guys some actionable steps. So what can you actually do as everyday residents in Florida to help with this problem so that you leave here with hopefully a little bit of hope? So we are going to mostly focus on plants. I am an animal scientist, so we'll talk a little bit about animals because I can't resist. We're going to start off talking about some of those definitions, like I said, and some of the damages. We're going to discuss the 5 list, and there are 5 invasive species list. One of the questions I get a lot, including all the way up to decision makers, is this plant on the list? And the fact is there's not the list of invasive species. There are 5, there's actually more than 5, but there's 5 primary lists in Florida. Some of those lists carry teeth, meaning that they are actually enforceable. They are legislative. If you are in violation of those laws, you can get a fine. You could even do jail time. Others are just informative and suggestive and helpful, but don't actually carry teeth. We're then going to talk about 2 case studies. So an example of a plant and an animal of when things went really wrong and the damages that happened. And then finish up by looking at something called the invasion curve that kind of describes how invasive species come into Florida or into any state, get established, and what actionable interventions we can do at each stage of that curve. At the end, I'm happy to open up for questions with the disclaimer that I don't know everything. Please don't share that information with my fiance. He's under the false impression. But I don't. And so I do have my handy dandy notepad. So if you guys ask me a question that is outside of my area of expertise, I don't make things up. So if I don't know the answer, I will write down your question and I will be happy to get back with you with a correct answer. So I'm an animal scientist, not a natural resource specialist, but I know a lot of really smart people. And so I'm happy to do that. The other thing I want to share with you guys before I forget, I brought a couple of my own resources, and so I'm going to pass these around. You can tell they're mine because they either say Lake County Master Gardener Plant Clinic because they belong to our office, or they say Brew or property of Megan Brew because they belong to me personally. So I'm going to pass these around. I just want to make sure I get them back, especially if they belong to the Master Gardener Plant Clinic, because I don't want them coming after me. But there's some really cool resources with pictures. Pictures tell a much better story than I can. But one I want to particularly share with you is one that just recently came out, and it's put out by the University of Florida. And you can order it on the University of Florida bookstore, which is ifasbooks.ufl.edu. And it's called Plant This, Not That. And it's a really cool flip book that shows, okay, here's a pretty invasive plant. You like the look of this? Here's an alternative that's either native or Florida friendly. So if you like this one, why don't you consider that one instead? I think it's just a really cool concept. We also have, we're going to use this as a giveaway, but I want to show it to you. If you don't have your name drawn for this one, don't feel sad because it's available online for free, so you can print it. And this one's actually put out by Lake County, which is really awesome. And this is the Greener Choices Guide, and I'll send this one around as well just so you can see it. And the website to print it off is on the back. It's put out by the Parks Department, but it's very similar to this one, just hyper local. So again, shows, if you happen to think this invasive plant is pretty, because a lot of them are, here's an alternative of something that's native that you could try instead. So I think that's kind of nice to, recognize that we like these plants for a reason, but why don't you try this instead? So I'm gonna put these over here, and if I could get a volunteer just to come grab them and distribute, that would be amazing. And then the final one that is also a giveaway, this is a really cool one. This is the Florida Friendly Landscaping Guide. And so this one talks you through a lot of really cool plants that are Florida friendly. So Florida friendly is not necessarily native, but they are non-invasive and appropriate for our climate. So another really awesome one. I used this one when I was designing the landscape at my home, and it's nice because it kind of goes by your plant palette and what shape and color you're looking for. So I brought a couple of these to be used as giveaways as well, but I'll pass this one out for you guys to look at as well. All right, so let's jump into some definitions. So what is a native plant? It sounds obvious, right? A native plant is a species that occurs naturally. So in Florida, we define native as a plant that has evidence of having been here in the pre-Columbian era. So we don't really know, how long a plant has been here, but we kind of cut it off as if it was here when Spanish explorers arrived, we consider it native. If it arrived after the Spanish explorers, it is introduced or non-native. So a non-native plant is a plant that did not occur naturally in a geographic area. So it could have come here on its own, maybe through changing climates. Plants are now kind of spreading into different areas, or it could have been brought on purpose by people. So we could have thought it made a nice landscape plant and brought it here. It could have hitchhiked here on accident, but for whatever reason, it was not here. There's no evidence of it having been here in the pre-Columbian period. An introduced plant is one that was brought here by people. So humans were involved. And sometimes that's done intentionally. So a lot of times people have come to the United States from all over the globe and they bring their plants with them. Or the horticultural industry often brings plants from other parts of the world because they're attractive and eye appealing or they fit different purposes. Or we introduce a lot of things accidentally. So things hitchhike in on cargo ships, on airplanes, on people's clothing when we travel. But regardless, a human was involved in bringing it in. A species that is established is a species that lives here without human intervention. So that means we don't have to feed, water, cultivate it, baby it, whatever. It is thriving in the wild, it's reproducing, it is taking care of itself, it is established in the wild. A nuisance species is a species that causes property damage, presents a threat to public safety, or is an annoyance. So that can be either native or non-native, and that can be confusing to people. It is fully possible to be a native plant and a nuisance. And a good example of this is Biden's alba, or Spanish needle. That is a native wildflower. And in the right place, Biden's alba is a wonderful plant. It's a pollinator plant. It can play a very important role in native ecosystems, but when it's popping up in your yard or when it's taking over Discovery Gardens, as it tried to do a year ago, it is a real nuisance. Speaking for myself personally, and I apologize if I'm sniffling today, I am not sick, I'm just disgusting. I have terrible allergies. So oak trees are a terrible nuisance to me, even though, no one would argue that our beautiful live oaks are a nuisance to most people. So nuisance is, really kind of one man's nuisance is another man's treasure. And then a noxious plant kind of is a step above nuisance. So it is a plant that directly damages crops, livestock, poultry, other interests of agriculture, irrigation, navigation, natural resources, public health, or the environment. So using our definitions, an invasive species can be defined as a non-native introduced species that has become established to the degree that it has become a nuisance or could be considered noxious. So in order to be considered invasive, it has to check all three boxes. It has to be non-native, it has to have been introduced by humans, and it has to cause some degree of harm. Most invasive species also share some other characteristics. So most of them have fast growth rates. Most of them have a short time to reproduction, so they get established pretty quickly. Most of them produce a lot of offspring or seeds. Most of them effectively disperse those offspring or seeds. Most of them are tolerant to many habitats, and they utilize resources, and they have no or few natural predators because they don't belong in this ecosystem. I think it's also really worth mentioning that all invasive species are non-native by definition, but not all non-native species are invasive. In fact, there's a lot of non-native species that are super important for our ecology or our economy. So examples of that would be most of our turf grasses, like Bermuda grass and Bahia grass, are non-native, but we love them. We wouldn't want them to go away. The European honeybee, the honeybee is incredibly important for pollination, for honey. They are not native, they are European. Beef cattle, I enjoy a good steak, probably more than most people. Non-native, they are brought actually into Florida. That's a good piece of trivia for you. Texas likes to say they're the cow state, but the first beef cattle entered the United States via Tampa. So we are the actual first cow state, but non-native. So there's a lot of really important non-native species, but they have to be non-native, introduced by humans, and cause harm in order to be invasive. Questions about that? Make sense? Okay. So in addition to using the correct terms, there was actually recent research done by the University of Florida that looked into some of the terms that we should avoid using. And this is more for professionals, but I think as we kind of empower you guys to help us in the fight with invasive species, it's also important that you understand the terms that you should avoid using. So they identified 6 terms that are very confusing to the general public and why we should avoid using them. So the first one is native invasive. So by definition, like we just said, an invasive species is non-native. So I think when people use this term, what they really mean is a native species that's a nuisance. But people will use that, they're like, oh, this species is really invasive, and they just mean it has an aggressive growth habit, or it's obnoxious and it's in the way that it grows, or it's very vigorous. But by definition, if it's a native species, it cannot be invasive. So we need to use proper terminology there. Another one is invasive weed. It's better just to say invasive plant. Weed is really a cultural term, so one man's weed could be another man's intentional planting, kind of like we talked about Biden's alba, which again is also native. And it could lead people to believe that all weeds are invasive, and that's simply not true. The other one is one that I use a lot because this was a common term for a long time, so forgive me if I use it later in the presentation, it's just still a bad habit, and that's invasive exotic. And it's redundant, so by definition, all invasives are exotic, but not all exotic plants are invasive. Also, the term exotic has other connotations, some of which are positive. So I just came back from an exotic vacation. I'm trying exotic cuisine. Those are all kind of positive connotations, so we don't want to talk warmly or lend a positive connotation to these plants. And then things like alien, foreign, non-indigenous are also all synonymous by non-native. So they're also kind of redundant, but they also have some political connotations. And this is an area that we really don't want to politicize. It doesn't matter how you vote. We all want to have the same feelings about this issue. So invasives are certainly an issue nationwide, but as Floridians, we should be especially concerned, and here's why. It is estimated that 85% of non-native plant species enter the United States through Florida. And this study is now 30 years old, but I would guess that it hasn't changed for the positive. Only a small percentage of those non-native plants are going to become invasive, but those that do result in pretty significant cost and damages. So the estimated cost of managing invasive plants alone in Florida, so just one state, averaged $45 million between 2009 and 2014. And that's 10 years ago money. So you can imagine what it would cost today. Florida is especially vulnerable to invasive species for a number of reasons. One thing is our peninsular shape. So we have a lot of different ports of entry, both by air and sea. We have a thriving tourism industry, so that brings people in from all over the world, and in their suitcases they could be packing all sorts of stuff on accident. That leaves us very vulnerable to unintentional introduction of invasive species. Our climate is very similar to other parts of the subtropical and tropical worlds. And we also have a very diverse ecosystem. So when you go places in Florida, we've got, scrub pines, we've got the ocean, we've got very dense jungly type of ecosystems. So with all of that, a plant can kind of find its home, and a plant can find a place to flourish. So all of those can create problems. There are more than 1 million species currently that are at risk of going extinct in the next decades, and invasive species have been identified as one of the 5 primary drivers behind extinction. In Florida, there are 135 threatened or endangered species in the state, and when you combine that fact with the vulnerability of Florida to even more invasion, it's really important that we become proactive in preventing new species from becoming established. This cute little butterfly here is the Miami blue butterfly. They are a federally endangered species, but the reason that they're really struggling right now is because of the iguana that has become established in South Florida. So the iguana doesn't eat the butterfly, but the iguana eats the host plant that they forage on. And so the butterfly's having a harder and harder time finding their host plant and are therefore not surviving to reproduce. So let's talk about the invasive species list and the laws that regulate invasive species. So Florida has 5 primary lists that categorize non-native invasive plants. So again, it's not enough to say that a plant is on the list because there's not really the list. Of the 5 lists, most often used to classify non-native plants in Florida, there's 3 that are regulatory. That means they actually have some laws behind them. And those are the federal noxious weed list, the Florida noxious weed list, and the Florida prohibited aquatic plant list. And 2, which are the FISC list, used to be called the FLEPC list, and the Florida assessment, or the UF-IFAS assessment of non-native plants. Those are recommendations that are based on current knowledge of distribution, ecological impact, and management difficulty. Those actually are probably used and referenced more than the ones that carry teeth, but I think they're both important to understand. There are other lists that are also important, so it gets very muddy. Other lists that we talk about are the early detection and rapid response list, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. UF's Florida Friendly Landscaping Plant Guide, and the Florida Natural Areas Inventory Invasive Species Information Descriptions. So we love bureaucracy, right? Lots of lists. So we'll start at the top, the Federal Noxious Weed List. So the Federal Noxious Weed Act of 1975 granted the Secretary of Ag the authority to categorize plants as noxious, and that created the Noxious Weed List. If a plant is on the list, it is illegal to transport any living part of the plant between states without a permit, and it also requires federal land management agencies to take appropriate action to manage invasive plants that are on the list on their respective properties and prevent spread. If you are found transporting plants, you are given a misdemeanor fine. Florida plants on the federal noxious weed list include things like Kogan grass, and we're going to talk about that later. Hydrilla, old world climbing fern. I don't know why that's a tongue twister for me, but I always have to think really hard when I say it. Tropical soda apple, which is one of my personal enemies because that's a major pasture weed, and Melaleuca. In 2000, most of the Federal Noxious Weed Act was incorporated into the Plant Protection Act, and the list is now managed by the USDA Animal and Plant Health Service Plant Protection and Quarantine Division, or the USDA APHIS PPQ. We love acronyms in government, if you haven't noticed. All right, so the state level counterpart to the federal list is the Florida Noxious Weed List, so that's state specific, and is very similar to the federal list. It was historically focused on upland plants, but it also includes 3 genera of parasitic weeds and 70 species of other weeds. So again, very similar to the federal list. It makes it unlawful to introduce, multiply, possess, move, or release any noxious weed on the list without a permit. So for example, I will sometimes, when I'm teaching these classes, I'll sometimes bring examples with me, but in order to do so, I have to fill out quite a bit of paperwork because I can't, for example, pick up Kogan grass in one part of the county and bring it to another part of the county to teach. And I certainly can't take that Kogan grass and then toss it out my window because that would be a terrible thing to do because I would then be planting it. So have I ever been pulled over and asked for that paperwork? No, I have not, but I am doing the responsible thing by making sure that I handle that material correctly. The final regulatory list, so the final list that includes teeth, is the Florida Prohibited Aquatic Plant List. It was originally overseen by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, but it is now under the purview of Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services, Bureau of Plant and Apiary Inspection. And it categorizes plants into 2 categories. So if it is a class 1 plant, it has the same rules as the Florida Noxious Weed List. So you cannot cultivate, sell, trade, or move them without a permit. Examples of class 1 plants include things like Australian pine, water hyacinth, and Brazilian pepper. Class 2 plants can be grown by nurseries, but only if they have a permit to do so and only if they're selling to customers outside of the state of Florida. Why do you think that's okay? Is it because we really don't like Georgia? It's because it's not invasive there. Things that are invasive in some states might not be invasive in other places, and even as we'll see, things that are invasive in South Florida might not be a problem for North Florida. So an example of that would be water lettuce is an example of a class 2 plant. All right, the list that we see referred to a lot of times when people call and they say, is it on the list? What they're really asking is about the FISC list. This is probably one of the more referred to lists. It used to be known as the Flexi list. Anyone want to know why it changed names? Remember how we talked about the terms that we should and shouldn't use? So it used to be the Florida Exotic Plants list, and now we don't call them exotic, so it is the Florida Invasive Species Council. It is one of the more widely referred to list of invasive species, even though it's not regulatory. So the FISC committee is made up of biologists, botanists, ecologists, and land managers who have a shared goal to list and prioritize all invasive plant species. Plants are added to the list every 2 years, and the list does not necessarily consider economic severity or the geographic range of the problem. So it's just looking at or the economic severity of the problem, or the economic positive impact that the plant may have. So it's just looking at, is the plant potentially a problem or not? They're not looking at necessarily the full big picture. So because of that, the official position of FISC is that this list should be used as the first step in identifying plants for inclusion in local ordinances, but that really it's up to decision makers to include these other factors when they're thinking about it. Plants on the list are also divided into 2 categories, kind of similar to the last list we talked about. So category 1 plants have been shown to alter native plant communities by displacing native species, changing community structure or ecological functioning, or hybridizing with natives. Category 2 plants are species that have increased in abundance or frequency but have not yet made as big of an impact. And then the final list we are going to discuss is the one that I like the most because it's a UF list and I'm a UF employee, so I'm a little bit biased. But this is the UF IFAS assessment of non-native plants in Florida's natural areas. We'll just call it the IFAS assessment for short because that's quite a mouthful. But it has 3 basic components. So it has the status assessment, the predictive tool, and the intraspecific taxon protocol. Those are all mouthfuls, right? You can tell a bunch of scientists made this up. So the one that we kind of think about the most from a public use standpoint is the status assessment. So that looks at the invasiveness of non-native species that currently occur in Florida's natural areas. And it ranks them, it basically gives them 4 different outcomes. So if it's a 1, that means it's not a problem. It can be used and recommended. And this is the one that we're kind of bound by. So as an extension agent, I am by my job not allowed to recommend plants that are a 3 or 4. So if it's a 1, that means, yeah, it's not native, but it's not a problem. It is not showing any signs of invasiveness. Use at your heart's content. A 2 means caution. So it doesn't appear to be invasive, but we've got some questions. Like it's showing some red flags. A 3 means that it is invasive and it may not be recommended except for specific and limited use approved by the UF IFAS Invasive Plant Working Group. And that conclusion is very rare because there's not many cases in which that would happen. And then 4 just means it is flat out invasive, we will not recommend it. So the cool thing about this use is that if it, these are looked at over and over again. So if it gets a 1 or 4, so we know, it's safe, no big deal, or it is definitely invasive, every 10 years it's going to get reassessed. So even if we're pretty sure it's safe, every 10 years we're going to check in and go, does this still look like it's safe? Or if it's invasive, we're going to check in, are you still causing problems? If it is a 2 or 3, that assessment gets done every 2 years. So it's a more rapid assessment to just say, is it still okay? And you can request an assessment, which is a really cool part. So if as I'm an avid hiker, I spend most of my weekends out in the woods, and if I'm walking around and I see this non-native plant that I know is not native, but I know that it's been listed as a 1, but I'm noticing it more and more in natural areas, and it seems to be taking over some natural plant communities, and I'm going, guys, I don't know. I mean, I know you looked at this 3 years ago and it's not up for review for another 7, but I've got some questions. I can submit a ticket basically to them and say, can you please reassess this? And they will reassess it. So they'll put it up for review faster, and you as residents can do that too. So I think that's a pretty cool thing. So they're really checking in on these plants to see what their assessment is. The other tool that we have here is the predictive tool. And so what's cool about this is it looks at other areas in the world that are similar to us. So it looks at, say, Australia, and an area in Australia that has a similar climate to Florida, and I'm just pulling Australia out of the hat here, and it looks at invasive species that they're dealing with and says, how likely is it for this species to come over to Florida? And if it came here, how likely would it be to take off? So it's kind of like predicting the future and helping us to prepare, and how on top of preventing this thing do we need to be. Like, this is causing huge issues for our neighbors over here. We need to really be on top of making sure this doesn't come here. And then it ranks it at being low risk, high risk, or moderate risk, and we need to evaluate further. If it's moderate risk, there's a whole decision tree it goes through, and that gets reevaluated as well. And then the last one is the intraspecific taxon protocol. That is, say you are a plant breeder and you're trying to breed some new variety of petunias. And so it goes through this tool to make sure, are you going to be releasing some beast on the state of Florida that's going to escape cultivation and take over? So it assesses the risk before that can get approved for production. So very cool stuff. There are currently over 900 species listed. Let me see if I can get this website to pop up for us. Maybe so, maybe not. Well, maybe not. Okay. I will at the end, will you guys remind me, and I will pull up these websites so we can play around and you can see it. But it is a very cool tool that you can get on, and you can plug in all sorts of stuff. And the other neat thing about the IFAS assessment is that you can look by region: North Florida, Central Florida, South Florida, so you can get pretty hyper local. So I think it's probably the most user-friendly of the list and the most responsive. All right, so let's talk some case studies. What happens when things go wrong? Kogan grass. Do you want to know what Kogan grass looks like? Think we have it in Lake County?
Yes, we have it here.
We have it everywhere. And this is a good time of year to see it because it's in bloom. And so you just see that sea of the white, it kind of looks like white feathers, but the white seed heads. So I say Kogan grass is a classic example of where you end up when you pave a road with good intentions. You guys have heard that saying, so I don't need to spell it out for you, right? So it came to the United States. It's grown in, or native to Asia, and it came here accidentally. On purpose accidentally. We didn't realize it was going to take off, but it was used as packing material back in the days before styrofoam and bubble wrap. It makes a good cheap packing material, so it came in, and it is a very, very vigorous grower, so it can grow from vegetative cuttings. So that's how it originally got here. And then some bright people thought, well, I wonder if cows would eat this. There's a lot of silica in it. If anyone's ever touched it, it has really sharp edges. So yes, cattle will eat it when it's teeny tiny babies and really succulent. With any degree of maturity, even the hungriest cow is going to turn her nose up at it. The only way you can get cows to eat it is by doing something we call mob grazing, which is when it's very young and you put the cows in a pen and basically say, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. And then they'll eat it and then be probably pretty mad at you and try to break the fence. And it's not a very effective means of control because 60% of this plant is underground in the rhizome. 60% of the biomass in this plant is underground. It's incredible. I admire these plants in a way because everybody's just trying to survive, and these guys are survival masters, but they're also not very nice. So it escaped cultivation in Florida. We brought it in for forage, thinking we'd feed cattle and it would be good for erosion control, and it just took off. It is now widely distributed throughout the Southeast. It's found in every continent except for Antarctica, which is incredible. So it's considered a pest in 73 countries. It is a problem with a capital P. Why is it a problem? Well, it forms really, really dense stands. You'll often see it growing in like a circle. And I've gone out on ranches where I've been like, oh no, you have Kogan grass. And they're like, that's fine. And it's about the size of one of these tables. And I'm like, no, you need to control that now. And here's how to do it. And it's a pretty aggressive herbicide regimen that you have to do. It's a multi-year treatment, and you need to get on that right now. And they're like, okay, Meg, I'll get on it. And then like 3 years later, I go back out and their whole pasture is Kogan grass. And they're going, yeah, I should have listened to you. And I'm like, you think? It doesn't go away on its own. It's not one of those problems you can turn your back on. It will grow aggressively, and it also spreads from mowing. So we have a lot of issues. You see it grow along roads because you have these, contract mowers that go out and they, mow these big swaths, and they're spreading it on their mower blades. It spreads in the wind. It spreads underground through these rhizomes. It is a bear to control. But one of the big problems, besides just displacing native communities, is it burns hot. So in Florida, part of our natural system is for things to catch on fire. People don't like to hear that, but that's how we're built. We have these longleaf pine communities and they're designed to burn. So the understory, we have lightning, the understory burns, all of the underbrush burns, and allows new growth to come up and the pine trees continue, and that's the cycle of life. What happens with the Kogan grass is that it burns so hot that it will catch the pine trees on fire, and then you end up with a forest fire. And I have a video on here, and remind me at the end when I can switch back and forth, I will show you a video from I think it was from Alabama State Forestry, but it shows what a forest fire with Kogan grass looks like, and it's scary. And especially as we start to push develop it, closer to some of these forested areas, and you see Kogan grass growing into these pine forests. We think about forest fires as really being an issue out west. Another 10 years, I think we're really going to be seeing more of it here potentially, largely driven by Kogan grass, and so it's something to really be worried about. So in Florida, we have losses of $35 million annually to the forestry industry, and then due to damages by Kogan grass. So scary, scary stuff. All right, I told you we were going to talk a little bit about critters because I am an animal scientist. So we're going to talk about feral hogs. Have you guys had issues with feral hogs in this development?
Yeah.
Not here? Oh, you guys better find some wood to knock on. Yeah, they're in pain. So the reason I wanted to talk about them, they are ranked #1 out of all invasive species in terms of damages in the Southeast. And they are the only species that appears on the top 3 in more than one invasive species list that are region specific. So swine were first imported to the state by early Spanish explorers, and they have been an acknowledged problem pretty much ever since then. So even before fence laws went into effect in Florida, when livestock were allowed to roam free, people were still like, these hogs, even though free-ranging livestock were the norm. So there are currently an estimated 6 million feral swine covering 32 states. They cause $1.5 billion in damages and control every year. So the damages can kind of be combined into 4 different categories, and we'll talk about those. Starting off with ag damages. So their rooting behavior, that's when they use their noses to kind of dig up and get to grubs and whatnot, causes damage to plant roots. It creates holes and ruts that can actually damage farm equipment, and in worst case scenario can actually damage equipment operators. So it's been known to cause tractors to flip. They have also been known to predate on newborn livestock as large as calves. So they're omnivores and they're opportunistic, which is really frightening. In terms of property damages, they can cause a tremendous amount of property damage in a very short amount of time. So they really like to dig up yards, golf courses, recreational areas, and there's been documented damage to things like irreplaceable historic and archaeological sites and even cemeteries. Ecological damages, so in a natural setting, pigs have been known to uproot longleaf pine seedlings and consume their soft roots, so to keep the forest from regrowing. They use the saplings and mature trees as scratching and scent marking posts, which damages the tree roots, the bark layers, and leaves the trees susceptible to insect pathogens. They trample and root up native plant communities and disturb the soil, which leads to the establishment of, guess what? Invasive plants. Yep. And feral pigs also compete with native wildlife for scarce food resources, predate on eggs and newly hatched young of ground nesting birds, salamanders, frogs, crabs, mussels, and snakes. And then the really kind of gross and scary part are their impacts on animal and human health. So feral swine will hang out near farms, and they will frequent animal areas to drink out of water trough and steal feed. And when they do so, they spread diseases to our livestock, such as pseudorabies, swine brucellosis, bovine tuberculosis, African swine fever, hog cholera, foot and mouth disease, and they carry over 40 intestinal parasites. But it's not just livestock who suffer, so feral swine can also carry zoonotic diseases. Zoonosis means that they can spread it to people. And so they can spread diseases to us, such as leptospirosis, brucellosis, E. coli, salmonella, toxoplasmosis, rabies, swine flu, trichinosis, and giardia. So delightful, right? And then they spend a lot of times in streams, and while they're there, they defecate, and that can cause an increase in fecal coliforms that make it unsafe for humans, and the associated turbidity can add contaminants that negatively impact aquatic life. And then finally, they are mean. So they have been known to chase and even injure both people and pets. When I grew up in North Florida, and I used to run, and probably one of the most scared times of my entire life was running, and all of a sudden I heard a noise behind me, and there was a boar probably this tall, and I think he was in rut, and he was very, very angry at me, and I learned I could climb a tree. I didn't know I could climb a tree, and I don't know what would have happened to me if I didn't climb a tree. But that was, I hike all the time in the Seminole State Forest with my dog, and I am way more scared of running into pigs than I am a bear. They can be very vicious animals. All right, so now that everyone's like maybe grossed out, depressed, a little scared, what can you do about it? So Kogan grass and feral swine are kind of examples of worst case scenario. You know, swine are everywhere, Kogan grass is everywhere. They're kind of past the point of control, but they did not start out that way. They didn't suddenly just appear with Kogan grass blanketing the county and feral swine everywhere. They started as a little bit of Kogan grass and a couple of pigs. We missed the opportunity to control those, but we have lots of opportunity to prevent other things from becoming problems. So there are opportunities for invention. So one way to think about how an invasive species gets introduced and established is the invasion curve. So this curve demonstrates how when a species is first introduced and the population is small and contained, eradication is possible. However, the more widespread and abundant a species becomes, the more difficult control becomes to the point where eradication is no longer possible. So you can see on the bottom, we've got time moving this direction, control costs moving up, and the area infested moving up. So we're going to talk about each part of the curve and where we can get involved. So at the beginning, we've got prevention. Of course, that is the most cost-effective and efficient investment of our resources, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That really involves restricting importation and introduction at ports of entry. The quantitative risk assessment, that's the one where we talked about UF kind of looking at our area, our surrounding neighbors and what's going on there, and is it going to become a problem here, and trying to prevent things from happening. That can be very helpful. Public involvement through programs like Don't Pack a Pest. Has anyone ever traveled internationally and seen that at airports? Where they like encourage you to check your baggage one more time, make sure that you're not bringing something back into the United States, or where they have the dog sniffing your bag, and oftentimes it's not checking for, you know, drugs or bombs. They're actually looking to see if you brought fruit, and it's not because they don't want you to enjoy fruit, it's because they don't want you to bring back something that's going to bring disease into the country. Exotic pet amnesty, that's a really cool program that they do too. So say you have a pet that you're not really supposed to have, and suddenly you've realized that, you know, keeping a cobra was not as easy as you thought it was going to be. Rather than letting it go, they're like, hey, no harm, no foul. On this specific day, you can give us this pet. We will take it and we won't, you know, fine you. And it encourages people to do that rather than release these pets. So an example of an animal that is in the prevention stage is the African puff adder. So this animal, this is a snake, obviously. It is responsible for more snake bite deaths than any other species on the continent of Africa. And it's been identified by UF as a potential invader because it would actually do super well in Florida were it to get released here. It would love it here. It would be like the perfect environment. It would like the climate. It would have lots of things to eat. Not many things would eat it. And for whatever reason, people who like to keep snakes, and no offense if any of you are herpetologists, but it's attractive for the pet trade. They think it looks like a cool snake and they'd like to keep it. But it's a very difficult snake to keep as a pet because it wants to kill you. So they've realized if it ever got in through the pet trade and people wanted to release it, it could cause major issues. So they have put pretty harsh bans on keeping this as a pet and restricted, you know, you were absolutely not allowed to import this pet into the United States, or this snake into the United States, because we recognize that this is a recipe for disaster. It is not allowed in the state of Florida. All right, so the next stage, we've got introduction. So a thing has been introduced. Once a plant or a pet does get past our prevention efforts and a small number of individuals are present, we have to turn our focus to eradication. So that happens after introduction. Eradication can also be possible if it's detected as soon as possible after arrival, and we take really aggressive steps immediately. These aggressive steps are called early detection and rapid response. So as Floridians, you should be familiar with EDRR, early detection and rapid response species, and these are very area specific. So each of our CISMAs, which is a cooperative invasive species management area, these are working groups put together to kind of, again, create another list of plants that are very specific. In Lake County, we have the Lake and Marion, the Big Scrub CISMA, and they define, okay, these specific 10 species are what we really want to focus on right now because they are just barely coming into this area and we want to prevent them from getting a hold. So you can identify and report these, and we're going to talk about how to report them, but there's a really cool app called I've Got One that you can download on your phone to report these species when you see them. There's also a 1-800 number that you can use. But an example of an EDRR effort that was successful and now is going through round 2 is the giant African land snail. So these were found. They are voracious eaters. They are a real pest for agriculture. And there was an emergency eradication program that was successful. They've now kind of been spotted again, so they're undergoing those efforts again. The next step is containment. So if the invasive species EDRR efforts failed, the invasive species is now established. Eradication is unlikely, but we want to prevent it from spreading. So at this stage, the general public is starting to become aware. You might not be a plant nerd, you might not be really into the ecology of the area, but you're going, you know, I've heard about this on the news. That's kind of the stage that this is. So an example of this are tegus. Anyone from South Florida? So tegus are a large carnivorous lizard that was brought in by the pet trade, and they are an example of a species that are in the containment stage. So currently populations are only in South Florida, and if you live kind of on the border of where they're at, they're really doing a big public campaign trying to help people understand what they look like, how to report them. They're even doing like door hangers, like report tegu sightings, because we know that in South Florida they've been established. We're probably not going to eliminate them, but we really want to prevent them from moving north on the peninsula. So it is a containment strategy. Let's keep them in that part of the state and prevent their spread. And then the last stage is long-term management. So at this point, eradication or containment are kind of off the table. It would be kind of like fighting a forest fire with a squirt gun. So the goal is to suppress the population such that you're protecting highly valued resources. So it would be things like keeping Kogan grass out of state parks. So another example would be Old World climbing fern. It's widespread in Central and South Florida. We're not going to eradicate it, but we're going to suppress growth through biocontrols and herbicide programs. We're going to do the best that we can to contain it where we can. So what can you do in addition to those steps? So again, become familiar with that IFAS assessment. So on that little piece of paper, there's some right at the sign-in table, a little half sheet that's got a lot of the resources, links to all of those plant lists that we talked about, including the IFAS assessment. But get familiar with that website, play around, kind of see, get what plants are on it, become a familiar user. Let your neighbors know about it. The more we can spread the word about it, the better. And then do not plant, transplant, cultivate, or purchase invasive plants. That's a big one. So yes, a lot of them are very pretty, but there's also a lot of beautiful native and Florida-friendly plants. And so spreading the word about those alternatives can be a great thing. One good opportunity, shameless plug here, the last Saturday in March, we're doing our plant sale at my office at the Discovery Gardens. The proceeds go to support the gardens, but they're all Florida-friendly plants. So there are lots of opportunities to do that. And you can check, if you're in a nursery and you're like, let me just triple check that this is Florida-friendly, that it is not on the IFAS assessment list. That's a great opportunity. Pull it up on your smartphone and just double check that it's not on the list. And then reporting those invasive species. So they've made it so easy now with that I've Got One app that you can, when you're out and about, you just take a picture and then it stamps the location if you have your GPS turned on and the time and date, and it notifies people who are in charge of that land, like, hey, we've got a tegu in Lake County. This is a big problem. And it helps those land managers who can't be everywhere. There's only limited resources, but you guys can kind of be weaponized in the fight against invasive species, and you can become the eyes and ears to be out there and actually helping with this. And that is a huge thing, because it really is going to take all of us to control this. So with that, are there any questions? That's my girl, Annabelle. Yes.
What, I have people come to me and say, I love my Mexican petunia, and I bought it at Lowe's. Why are you telling me it's invasive?
So, two answers to that. And I will preface this by saying I'm not a plant person.
Right.
I mean, I'm not a horticulture person. I am a bad weeds person. One is that there are some species of ornamental plants that are sold at in the horticulture industry that have been made sterile. So there are some varieties of plants that are sterile that are there'll be this variety that is invasive and this variety that's sterile that's fine. I don't know if there's varieties of Mexican petunia off the top of my head that are fine.
They're working on it.
Okay.
But the ones that people plant in our community
Are not.
and
They spread. And then the other answer to that is, remember we talked about the list, there's some that, stores are not allowed to sell because they're on those noxious weed lists.
Right.
And there's some, if they're not on the noxious weed list, it's a suggestion that this is not a great idea, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not allowed to do it. So then it's a matter of educating and saying, hey, you like the look of this,
Right.
why don't you try this as an alternative? And here's why you might not want to try this, and this is a better one. So the kind education can be helpful. And I agree, there's a lot, telling on myself, my home had a beautiful golden rain tree in the front yard. And I didn't put it there, it's been there for 70 years. But it's as close as we get to fall colors in Florida, just about, and it took me years to finally bite the bullet and cut it down, even though I knew, I'm like, this is a bad tree. This is an invasive a plant that should not be here. But gosh, I love it, it's so pretty. And I had people stop in front of my house and ask for a cutting, and I would tell them, no, you can't, it's invasive, and here's why you can't have it. But at the same time, I'm going, I should really do this, but it's so pretty. And I would pull the little saplings up when they came up, I was kind of tried to justify, well, it's been here, I didn't plant it. It was the wrong thing to do, but it's beautiful. And it's kind of like the same thing whenever we do things. We think, well, why should I make a good choice if no one around me is making a good choice? What does me making a sacrifice do if no one else is making a sacrifice? So just encouraging people that, here's why it's important, and here's a good choice you can make. But yeah, it's tough. Yes, ma'am.
Are there any efforts to expand the toxic list, the toxic plant list, so these plants cannot be sold?
The invasive?
Yes.
Oh, the noxious? That I don't know. So they reassess that pretty regularly, and that is so far above my pay grade. Yes.
Because many of us come from other states, and we go to the nursery, and we have no clue this is invasive.
Sure.
So it's too late. It's planted.
Right. Yeah, the noxious weed list, decisions to make that are done at a level way above my pay grade.
Yes. Any
But
level
yes.
up there.
Yes,
Does
and I
anyone care?
don't know who is working on that. I think the more regular citizens get involved and care, the more likely the legislative body will care and move in that direction. But I think, there are people working on those sort of things. But I think there does have to be a demonstrated that it is causing real damages before it's going to be added. But the more people that you can educate and say, hey, I learned something today, and did you know that there's this assessment list, and you can get online and go to your phone and you can look and see, that also is going to make a difference. But yeah, you're right, once it's planted, it's hard to
For
get back.
example, the tegu should never have been offered as a pet.
Sure. Yeah. Other questions?
Can I ask you, do you believe
Sure.
in Roundup?
I'm sorry?
Do you believe in Roundup? Because I don't have that in my home.
It is a very effective herbicide, yes. I don't have a belief one way or the other, but it's an efficient and safe herbicide based on the evidence that we currently have. Other questions? Do you guys want to see the IFAS assessment website?
Yes.
Would that be helpful to you? If I can get to it. Let's see. All right. So here is the website. All right, so we're going to look at my favorite plant that is both toxic and invasive. But you can see you can type in the name and it pops up and it tells you central, north, and south prohibited. So it's a number 4. It gives you detailed data, and then it also links you to other information about it. So if you want to learn more about it, this is another really good website, the UF IFAS Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants.
Yeah, this one's all over legacy.
Which one? The rosary pea? That's scary stuff. But you can see it's got really beautiful pictures of all of them. It goes by alphabetical order, so if you just ever wanted to just scroll through and see any of them. And some of them, you know, it'll show like they're not, these are not necessarily all invasive, these are just non-native plants. So for example, one of them that I really love, this is peanut, perennial peanut, non-native and not a problem species anywhere in Florida. This is a wonderful ground cover that's non-native. So that is a really, this is a good tool to get familiar with. And then the other one I wanted to show you on here. Yeah, so this just shows, it's a little hard to see on the screen, but it shows the Kogan grass burning in a forest that should have just been an understory burn, but it shows the, you know, the whole forest is burning down pretty hot, so scary, scary
We
stuff.
have Kogan grass here in the community in several areas, and we are trying to keep it from spreading. Is there a published, and I think I've seen it, a published month by month of what you should be doing?
Yeah, I can email it to you.
Okay.
I can email it to you. Just remind me if I forget, because my brain is like Swiss cheese. I actually, let me give you guys, well, I swear I put them in here, my cards. I did.
Oh, thank you.
If anyone else wants my card, I'll put it on the table, but feel free to email me if you have any questions, if you think through anything we talked about.
Are there any more questions for Megan? So,
All right, well, I really appreciate you guys. I hope it wasn't too boring.
so what we,
Thank you.